are listening to the Moody Girl podcast with me, Emily Fazer. Throughout this series, we're going to be opening the minds of experts and delving into the world of alternative healing methods. So welcome, Carlos, to the Moody Girl podcast. Thank you so much for being here today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me to be on the show.
Yeah, I'm super excited. It's a subject that I know probably a very small amount on. I've always found it very fascinating. And even just before recording just now, you're already kind of going into so many amazing, studies that you're currently working on. So I'm really looking forward to sharing the amazing work that you're doing, your story with the Moody Girl audience today. So thank you for joining us. And I mean, if we start this back at the beginning, so for any listeners, I mean, I'm based in the UK. I've kind of mentioned to people about ayahuasca before in the past, and some people are somewhat conservative when it comes to mind-altering experiences, and may not even know the basics, so exactly what it is, So, I mean, if we can just strip it back to the basics, and for anyone listening who has never heard of it, who doesn't know of your foundation, can you give us like a general brief, synopsis of what you're doing and what exactly ayahuasca is?
I'll do my best. So ayahuasca is the name of a vine that grows in the Amazon rainforest. Its Latin name is Banisteriopsis caapi, and it has become or developed over thousands of years to be the core of a plant medicine healing tradition of nearly 100, if not more, indigenous groups spread across the Western Amazon region. And that vine was used by itself, but then at some point more recently, it was mixed with another plant called chacruna, which is the Latin name would be Psychotria viridis. And so nowadays, when we talk about ayahuasca as a medicine, we usually are referring to a combination of those two plants, Psychotria viridis and Banisteriopsis caapi. But Banisteriopsis caapi is the actual plant called ayahuasca, and the medicine that's made from it is also called ayahuasca. Of course, there's a lot of different names because there's so many indigenous languages that use it, but ayahuasca has become kind of the global accepted name for it. And what that medicine does is, I mean, from a chemical perspective within the Western medical world, they would say that it is an orally activated dimethyltryptamine experience. So the chacruna contains dimethyltryptamine, and the ayahuasca vine contains what are called MAO inhibitors or monoamine oxidase inhibitors that prevent our normal gut enzymes from breaking down dimethyltryptamine, such that it can then like go and stay in our brain for an extended period of time, like 2 or 3 or 4 hours. Dimethyltryptamine is produced in our body as well as all living beings, and typically it's produced in our pineal gland. And so even though you could call it an orally activated dimethyltryptamine experience, that's not totally understood for sure. And because dimethyltryptamine wasn't part of the ayahuasca for maybe thousands of years, I don't think that that's like a complete accurate understanding of what the medicine does. But what we can see, or at least my perception of what happens when someone ingests ayahuasca, is that it reduces sensory gating, which is sensory gating is our natural conditioning to reduce how much sensory information we're able to process. So the visible spectrum is a perfect example. While our eyes are taking in a very wide frequency spectrum of light and colors, we only process what we call the visible spectrum. And then the same with sound, and all of our senses essentially reduce how much we have access to or can process. And that's really because it would make life incredibly challenging if we could hear all those sounds, and if we could see all those colors. It would be almost impossible to walk down the street, definitely drive a car, like all of those things, right? So evolutionarily, we've developed these limitations, these kind of blinders for our sensory perceptive abilities, and ayahuasca reduces those blinders, or like it, opens them up to give the sensation of an amplified sensory perception experience. And
Wow.
for that reason, it's done in ceremony in a very controlled setting, so that you're not driving your car, so that you're not walking down the street, so that you're just in one dark space. Now, the darkness would be to further enhance the sensitivity of our eyes, so that we can like go as far as possible into light frequencies that might normally be invisible or inaccessible to our consciousness, as well as in silence, or at least people in their participation aren't talking to each other. It's kind of a very inner experience, and that ceremony process has been developed also for thousands of years. So it's really, to me, a science of consciousness enhancement in conjunction with taking a substance that allows us an expanded awareness or a hypersensitivity to sensation. And what is super fascinating to me, all of it really is fascinating, but that because we are taking in all that information, our subconscious, or our consciousness as a whole, does keep that information, even though we might not have access to it. And so if I take ayahuasca and now I think of a memory in my life, I will also have more awareness of what was happening when I look into that memory. You know what
Mm.
I'm saying? So that's like
Wow.
the really fascinating part. So there's this incredible opportunity when you have an expansion of awareness to see like more of the world or reality or yourself,
Mm.
and that obviously has some real advantages. But
Mhm.
then you can also access that expansion of awareness in your memories, which
Wow.
can then really help you to correct any inaccuracies in your interpretation because of your own limitations, right? So in that sense, when we're talking about looking into the resolution of traumas, that plays like a really big role. So essentially, there's this science of consciousness enhancement using this incredibly unique medicine that helps to reduce sensory gating for us, or to amplify sensory perceptive ability. And that is the core of a plant medicine tradition that has developed for many, many, many generations in the Amazon rainforest. So our organization works with indigenous healers who have come from those multi-generational traditions, and then we essentially organize and host programs, healing programs, where people from all over the world can do that in a very safe and reliable way, but also with an understanding that we provide like our own interpretation into the Western mindset, so that these concepts can be understood. Like what I'm doing for you right now is my part, where if you spoke to an indigenous curandero, they probably wouldn't put it into that language because they don't understand the world that we come from. So that's where like our organization bridges that gap between two kind of distinct perceptions of reality, such that the people that need that help can understand it and go as deeply as possible with their own healing processes.
Wow. I mean, just so much to think about what you've just said there. But yeah, I mean, like, for anyone, I guess, who comes to the Ayahuasca Foundation, how long is their stay with you when they do, like an ayahuasca retreat, or, how does that look? So is it like a big thing, or is it small, intimate groups? Do you handpick the shaman? Do you have one shaman per person? There's so many questions I have.
Sure. Well, we base it, of course, on the indigenous tradition. We work with one indigenous group, and we really work with one family within that indigenous group, which is the Shipibo Kunibo is the name of the tribe, or we would just call them Shipibo. And um, we work with one family, which is the Mahua Lopez family. I call them those two names because in South America and other cultures, they use both names, the mother and the father.
Hmm.
And so the Mahua Lopez refers to like essentially two familial lineages that came together when Don Enrique Lopez married Doña Vilma Mahua, and their tradition became this unique creation, when two multi-generational traditions were brought together and essentially fused. And so that's the only people that we work with, and
Mhm.
they run all of our programs.
Wow.
I like to keep it that way because that means that the tradition is the same. We do it the same way every program, even when there's other people involved, they're still part of a very similar tradition. But it's interesting to note, just because these are three curanderos, I did have four curanderos from that family. So at one point I was working with all three brothers, Enrique, Miguel, and Rono Lopez, and then also Doña Vilma Mahua. And even within them, they don't do it the same.
Mm.
It's not like it's not the exact same for each one. And that to me points to something that I describe as the art form of healing.
Mm.
And that's one of the things I'm really passionate about, to try to return our understanding of healing into a acceptance or acknowledgement of the art form. And that speaks directly to the way that the ceremonies are held, because the curanderos, I'm sorry, I use the word curandero. Shaman is another word, but that's not the word that we would use. So I'm just going to keep
Yeah.
using
Yeah.
curandero.
Yeah,
It
please
means
do.
it means healer,
Hmm.
from curar, to cure.
Hmm.
And so the ceremony is a curandero singing. They're performing. It's a total performance. But through those songs, they are expressing a combination of heart and mind in a way that we don't really see, I think, in Western medicine. And we don't really think about Western medicine as an art form. But when you put it into art form, it really does bring the heart into it and the emotions. And, when we listen to music, we feel that, right? It's not an intellectual experience. And when we see and we witness art, whether it's dancing or painting or whatever, like, it is a holistic experience for us, where it combines our emotions and our minds and our thoughts. And that to me is a better way to approach healing, because we are emotional bodies, beings, and we do have physical bodies, but you can't just do one or the other, right?
Hmm.
And so our shorter programs are what we refer to as retreats. They're intended for people that are just looking to be healed. And we have 10-day retreat. That's our shortest program. And then an 18-day retreat is our longer retreat. Then we have educational courses, and those are for people that feel a call to be a healer, that already recognize in themselves that they have a natural ability to help people. And they are obviously like pulled in a preference towards plant medicines or indigenous traditions. And so we have a 4-week course that we call an empowerment course, which is really about teaching a person how to take responsibility for their own healing and, be their own healer with knowledge from these indigenous traditions or from the Shipibo tradition. And then we have an 8-week course that we call the initiation course. And that's for students or people that really feel that it's their calling to work with ayahuasca as the core of their own healing practice, such that they want to hold ceremonies in their home countries and want to work in that tradition to help people in their home countries. So we've had that course. We just finished our 51st course.
Wow.
And our 4-week course we started in 2017 when we opened a new research center. So we also host research for those retreats and programs, and that's what our organization does.
Yeah, wow. I mean, there's so much to it. I mean, when you say you conduct research after retreats, what type of things are you looking at? Are you looking at, how people arrive, and then the level of health when they arrive, and then the level of health when they leave? How do you measure that? If you could talk through that process, that would be amazing.
Right. In the beginning, the research, we've been doing this research for 8 years, or hosting this research, I should say, because I don't do it. I'm not a doctor or a scientist, but I collaborate with a team called Onaya Science from the UK, actually.
Oh, cool.
And our first research project, they funded just on their credit cards, but it was enough to show the value of the research to continue, that they were able to get a grant from the British Medical Research Council, which was the first ever government funded ayahuasca research. So that was kind of cool.
Wow.
And really thank you to the British Medical Research Council for doing that. But that research was pretty much what you're describing. They filled out psychological evaluations that were measurements that could give them somewhat like a numerical measurement of where they were for depression, for anxiety, for different types of depression and different types of anxiety, for overall quality of life and emotional and psychological well-being. And then those evaluations were given again after the retreat, and then they were given again 6 months later to follow up to see if the effects were lasting. And that was, I mean, those results were really amazing, especially the follow-up. Like in the case of depression, there was a sharp decline in the symptoms of depression from before to after, but 6 months later, it had continued to decline. And with, so with no treatment, except what had happened 6 months prior, people were still less depressed and continuing in that direction. So that really spoke to like a permanent change, and that the permanent change was even like going to be more expansive as time went on, because as that person integrated the profound transformation of the retreat, it would then like, permeate into the other aspects of their life. And, so that was like fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that was one of my questions, actually. I was going to say, like, yeah, because you can always do something, whether it's a retreat or, there's so many different health practices out there. And whilst you're in it, it probably feels great. But as you say, 6 months down the line, life gets on top of people. But what you're saying is that still continued to work. So, I mean, scientifically, how does it continue in the brain, or is it still kind of in the system? How like, it's mind baffling.
Well, what is the it, right? I
Yeah,
think
I
that you
know.
mean the
Yeah.
medicine, and it's
Yeah.
not. And that's
Yeah.
where it kind of really changes the way that we should be looking at healing and looking at what medicine should do for us. But maybe just touching on the next phase of the study. So that was how the studies started, but then we introduced, or the research team introduced a look at epigenetics. So they started taking saliva samples before and after and 6 months later as well. And then they did genetic expression analysis. So they looked at whether a gene had been activated or not leading up to a retreat, and then whether that gene was still activated or inactive after a retreat, and then again 6 months later. And they targeted 3 genes specifically that are already known to be associated with how we remember traumatic events. So if you've had a trauma in your life and it is it is like you are suffering from the trauma, then a gene called sigmar-1 will be activated. And so we can, this is the understanding that we've gotten to at this point, that you could analyze a person's genetics and through that see if they are impacted by trauma in their life, if they have an activated sigmar-1 gene. And then after the retreat, looking at that same sigmar-1 gene, it was deactivated. And so that would suggest that through the process of the retreat, there was a resolution to the impact that traumatic events had, or at least how they transformed the way that they remembered those events, is a really better or more accurate way of describing what happened. And then 6 months later, it still was deactivated. And so that kind of speaks to the heart of it, right? Especially with how we remember. Now, that to me is like very, very important, because trauma is not the experience that we have. It's the impact the experience we have has on us. And a big part of that is how we remember the experience. And how we remember the experience is actually how we interpret the experience, right? We don't remember the experience in its pure state. We remember our interpretation of the experience. And the interpretation of our experience, or the memory of our experience, then serves as a reference for when we have any similar type of experience. We reference our memory of, as an aid. It's really like a program that should help us, right? Like, here's a situation. What should I do? I'm going to think, what did I do before? Right? Like that's it happens just like that, without us choosing to or not. It just happens. The same way that if I just started telling you about whales and I went on a whale watching trip right now, like, you're already looking for whale information, like, did I watch a whale documentary? Did I hear some piece of news about whale? It just happens, but it's to help us, right? It's to help us navigate the complexities of life. Unfortunately, when we have a really detrimental memory that goes against our well-being, we still reference it, and then it creates a negative response. And now we're like trapped in this loop where we have a negative response to an experience, we interpret it negatively, we remember it negatively, and that negative memory serves as a reference for our next response. And that's how I describe what trauma does to us. Whereas if you can enter into that expanded state of awareness that I described as the effect of ayahuasca done in that scientific consciousness enhancement ceremony, then you have the opportunity to change the interpretation. And by doing so, you change the memory. And when you change the memory, you influence in a different way how you'll respond the next time. And that is how that program can be alleviated. Now, when you're in a state of expanded awareness, it's the easiest way to describe it would be turning on the light in a dimly lit room. So, you're in a dimly lit room, you can see stuff, but you can't totally see it all, right? Like you have enough to like make out what you think is going on in there, where everything is, or what it all is. And then you turn the light on and a much brighter light happens, which gives you much more clarity. Oh, that's, what I thought, oh man, I thought that was something different, and so you see everything with much greater clarity. That's the expansion of awareness, right? That's the amplification of sensory perception, except that I'm giving the example as exterior instead of interior, but essentially that's the idea, right? What if I could turn the lights on and see much more of my environment, or much more of my life? And so right off the bat, you're like, oh, I got that wrong. Like if you thought that something in the corner was, I don't know, like an animal or something, and now you turn the light on and you're like, oh shit, that's like one of my kids' toys. Like you're never going to think it's an animal again. You know what I mean? Like you just corrected it, and you'll never think it's an animal again. You might have thought it was an animal for 25 years. But now, because of this expansion of awareness, or this amplification of sensory perceptive ability, this turning the light on, you know what it is more accurately. Wow. And so you change your memory. Now you might still have, for so long, I thought it was this, until I realized, and that is really like a way that gets described when people talk about their experiences. And so because of that, it is permanent. It's not that like you're trying to convince yourself of something that you're not still sure of, but it sounds better if you think this way, which I'm not against, but it's just not as profound. This is really like, I saw it, like I saw it with my own eyes. Like
totally.
It's different, it's different than the way I thought. I understand. And so when you have that type of experience, then you're not going to go back. You're not going to go back like, oh, I learned the truth, but maybe I'll go back and think it's wrong. Like you wouldn't do that. You don't do it. And so it's a real like magical experience to be able to have that opportunity.
Wow. I mean, because even with myself, like I've never been lucky enough to, try ayahuasca, but I've always, kind of been interested in it. but I myself am quite a like anxious person, and have dealt with my own demons throughout my life, and have, you know, gone on that self-help journey, whether it be, you know, trying to reprogram my brain in so many different ways, which seems like a lot of work at the time, you know. And what you're describing sounds incredible. I mean, I guess the one thing, and this is probably from your perspective, it might seem so, I don't know, silly, but from my perspective, I've always been worried what would come up if I was in like an ayahuasca ceremony. What if, you know, you hear these stories of like a bad trip, like a bad acid trip, or and I don't know, I guess it's that element we as human beings we're grasping onto control throughout the whole of our lives, and as soon as we almost hand over the keys to whatever's going on in our subconscious mind, it feels like a big key to hand over, you know. So what would be your you know, have you ever experienced anyone who had a bad experience, and how do they overcome it, or how did they, you know, work through that to then come out the other side?
Yeah, well, everything you just said is like 98% of people, you know, say that it's very, very common. And by that I mean like the concern that what's going to come up, you know. Um and and I guess like, you know, we're all like always trying to navigate what's going to come up. You know, even if it's not an ayahuasca experience, we're always like concerned about what's going to come up. Like, will I be able to handle whatever my imagination is trying to create fear about, you know?
Mhm.
And I think that ayahuasca just kind of like stands out because you know that you're going to see more. It's like, oh my God, do I really want to turn the light on? You know, like, do I really want to see what's there? Um, but there's the like positive component to fear, which I would call faith, because, you know, both fear and faith are based on your imagination, right? It's like, I don't know what's going to happen and I'm scared.
Mm.
And faith is like, I don't know what's going to happen and I know it will be exactly what I need, you know.
Mm.
And so they're the same kind of concept or the same situation, but two different ways of processing it. And I wish I could just be like, so don't be scared, just don't be scared anymore, you
Yeah.
got it. But that's really like what we try to do, and that's why I call it a science of consciousness enhancement, because the tradition has developed for such a long time that for you and I, we didn't grow up with that tradition. You know, we
Mm.
didn't have a shaman who was doing this stuff that was at the core of our self-identity, how we understood our world and how we relate to it. And all of those elements were defined by these cultural paradigms. We didn't grow up in that paradigm.
Mm.
And we grew up though in our own paradigm where we do, or at least did, I think that it's fading, but when you saw a guy or a person in a white jacket with a stethoscope and they had like a clipboard or something, you trusted that person. Like,
Mhm.
if they told you that they just did some tests and they came back with this and you need to do this, you're like, let's do it, you know.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think that is fading, and but that's like a good example at least. So if you
Mhm.
grew up in a Shipibo culture, you weren't like, oh my God, what's going to happen? You were much more inclined to have that faith
Mm.
because you already had built upon so many of these truths that had been conditioned by the cultural experience. So like you just knew there was a bunch of things that you just know.
Mm.
And that speaks, I think, to the complexity of consciousness, right? Like, we are building on all of these ideas, and we have an idea that becomes like a truth for us or a truth in our culture, and then on top of that we build all these other beliefs, and our whole belief structures, you know, down to these foundations of truth that aren't really truth, but as
Mm.
long as we hold them as truth, then they serve as truths in our belief system. And that's where like if you turn the light on and you realize, shit, one of my truths isn't true, then everything I built on it doesn't have anything to stand on anymore. And that can seem scary. Yeah,
Mm,
it's kind of like saying my whole world might come crashing down.
mm,
But that would be the fear, like, language. But the other language would be that I just got rid of all the bullshit that I had been living my life as.
yeah.
And, and so you do the best that you can, like, you
Yeah.
just do the best that you can. I do, like, as my job in our organization, I schedule calls with every person, and we have conversations similar to this as I
Mhm,
try my best to guide them, away from fear towards faith, and the way that our organization presents itself. And, like, we're constantly doing the best that we can to ensure that a person is safe and in good hands, and
mhm,
that the outcome will be beneficial for them. And I think that speaks a lot. Like, I
mhm.
think that work does a lot. Now, do people have bad trips? Well, it's not so simple to say what a bad trip is, right?
Yeah, true.
Normally you would say a bad trip is if you are in the experience and you say, "Man, I don't like this. This is," if you say something like, I don't know, you can swear, right? I can swear.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Like, if you say, "I'm fucked up right now," I am
yeah.
so fucked up, if that's, like, starting to be the language that you're using, then you might say that this is a bad trip.
Mm,
But if you are revisiting a very emotionally traumatic experience so that you can improve your understanding of it,
mm.
well, yeah, man, that's not going to be a fun time.
No.
You're not going to be like, oh, great, I get to, like, look at this fucking thing that's been, like poisoning my life for the last decade.
Yeah.
But if you come out of it and you have improved your understanding to a degree where you can say, I think I'm good, like, I
Mm,
think I'm fixed, then fuck, let's have the bad trip again. So
yeah.
it's not so much about whether or not you have a bad trip, it's really about whether you think it was worth it. And
Mm,
that comes, you might not see that right away, that
yeah.
comes from later on when you actually see yourself in that experience. You're like, oh shit, I'm not triggered right now. Like,
Mm,
oh shit, I don't have anxiety,
mm,
and then you start to kind of rebuild a new you, where
yeah.
you're starting to say used to, because there's a new you now. So it's like, man, I used to get so anxious when this happened, but
Mm,
not anymore. Or,
mhm.
man, I used to get so triggered, or I used to this, I used to that, and that's when you really start to confirm. And then all of a sudden you're like, that was the greatest night of my life,
Yeah.
and maybe an easy example would be, is labor, like, is childbirth a good or a bad trip? You know,
Yeah. So
like,
true.
right in the middle of it might not be so good, but very, very often it is the greatest day of a mother's
Mm,
life, but
yeah.
not that day. They're not like, this is the greatest day of my life, like, they might try to say that, what I mean? But I think that might be an easy, like,
No, I feel
example.
like I totally got that. And I mean, when you put it in those terms, for me already, it feels like the anxiety is taken away from it. Because if you've got all of these traumas, and I mean, I literally had a therapy session this morning where we revisited some, childhood stuff where I got like super emotional about, and they weren't, to the outer, audience, they're not huge traumas, but it's something that I'm still holding on to, and I'm 33 years old, and so after that conversation today, I was just like, poof, feel like I've got a bit of like a hangover from revisiting those, even in like a discussion base. So from you just going through that and saying, actually, yeah, it's not going to be the greatest thing to revisit these traumas and to look them square in the eye in this, you know, quite confronting ceremony space. But actually to be able to like take that rucksack of rocks off your back, you know, and just chuck it to one side and be like, ah, yes, I can look at this differently now. I haven't got this weighing me down. So I resonated with that hugely, and hopefully any listeners at home as well, you can kind of resonate with that too. So thank you for that. I mean, plant medicine, I understand obviously you're super passionate about that. Plant medicine for me was, I guess, my gateway into healing. In the UK, like a medical herbalist isn't as like popular as in the States. But I managed to find a medical herbalist and she helped me with some autoimmune conditions. So the audience will know very well now I've got psoriasis, and I've kind of, you know, battled that throughout the past kind of 4 years. And I was reading a little bit more about a digestive issue that you had, and correct me if I'm wrong, that was cured through ayahuasca. Did I read that right?
Yeah, you did. Yeah, if you don't mind, I just want to touch on one thing that you said, and I think that it's really important for your listeners and everyone in the world to understand it. You said that your traumas weren't that bad. And I think that's also like a totally common thing. But I think that unfortunately it's the result of, you know what I was saying, like building on truths, right? That we perceive a trauma by the experience. The severity of a trauma can be determined by the experience. But that is not accurate. The severity of the trauma is determined by its impact on us. And I read a really wonderful book. I'm a father. I have an 8-year-old daughter, and I try to read some books, you know, like to be a better parent. This book is called Self-Driven Child. It's written by a child psychiatrist, and I apologize to him because I don't remember his name, the author. But he brought up something really very, very powerful, and I want to like reference him because he is a doctor, right? And he does like know maybe better than if I were to just say it without that reference. But he described a boy in a bad part of Chicago who witnessed his brother get shot in a drive-by shooting while sitting on their front steps. And it had a really big impact on him. And I think saying that, everyone would be like, yeah, of course, like, what a traumatic experience. But then the author contrasted that with a young girl, same age, in a very affluent part of Chicago, who had developed this fear of failure, but had like went to private school, you know, had everything, lived in like a mansion, went to ballet school, you know, like all of these like incredible gifts that we would measure in what she had for opportunities in life. But yet her trauma was equally crippling to her. And so he did evaluations on these psychological evaluations that give a measurement of trauma. They were the same.
Wow.
And so I think it's really, really important that we don't devalue our own trauma or the impact it has on us, because that lends itself to saying, buck up, you know, like just fucking deal with it, man. Look at these people. I'm going to imagine their trauma is way worse than mine, and therefore I shouldn't feel as bad. You know, and you're like, that's not helping the process. And I'm not trying to be critical of you. I think it's a really important message for everyone to understand, is that it's not about what happened to you. It's about the impact of what happened to you on you. And so you can have two people have the exact same thing happen to them. And one person, let's say you get a dog like attacks you, you know, and so two people, they both get attacked by a dog. And one person could have this lifelong fear of dogs, that if they even see a dog, it creates this panic attack. And the other person goes on and has dogs for pets, and like they both had the exact same thing happen. but
Mm.
yet the impact it had could be totally different.
Yeah.
And in that sense, you could be crippled by something that unfortunately someone else might be like, whatever, dude, that what, like, oh, unfortunately there's that like level of lack of understanding. But for each person, just to recognize that, like, hey,
Mm.
there's no measurement of who got more fucked up by their traumas because of my imagination of what scale the experience was. That's not a great understanding, and it's not the reality. It's
Mm.
really about how it impacts you, and no matter what happened in your life, if it had a traumatic impact on you, then that's completely valid and shouldn't
Mm.
be like talked down, and that
Mm.
you should like acknowledge it in an effort to resolve it.
Yeah.
um so yeah, my own digestive issue, I don't think that my digestive issue was trauma related, and we kind of like switched over because of
Mm.
the segue of plant medicine. I definitely did have trauma that was resolved in my first experiences with ayahuasca, and as a result of that, well, as a, the complexity of consciousness, I got to a point where I was like, I'm gonna fix this digestive issue. Like,
Mm.
I was so empowered, like, I'm gonna do this. Now, my digestive issue was that I threw up every single morning. My
Wow.
digestion was not good.
Mm.
It was something I always had to be like mindful of everything I ate. Like, even if I fasted, I would throw up water. I
What?
was just, yeah, it was like a problem. And I went to a doctor, and he did like an x-ray, I want to say. And he showed me this like blotch in my throat, and he said that I had a cyst in my esophagus and that it was like draining into my stomach. And so I took those x-rays to an eye, ears, nose, and throat specialist, so another doctor, and he put them up on the light board or whatever, and he was like, what, this? Oh no, that's a thumbprint. Right. So now I'm like, oh, what? Like, man, like, so I don't have a cyst. He's like, no, you don't have a cyst. And he's like, you have an ulcer. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, because of those two being so totally different, I was like, I'm just going to go and see one more doctor, so let me like, which one of these is more accurate, I guess. And the third doctor was like, you don't have an ulcer and you don't have a cyst, you just have acid reflux. And so I was like, what the fuck,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
aren't you all supposed to be kind of on the same page here? Like, what do I do, just choose which of the problems that you've presented is the one that I will believe I have? Like,
Mm.
it just was completely unsatisfying for me. So I just said, fuck it all. Like, I don't trust any of you anymore. And I began like looking for remedies. And that was like a big part of how I found ayahuasca. It
Wow.
intrigued me for so many other reasons, but that was kind of the seed to plant. So I dealt with that issue for 3 years. Finding ayahuasca in, 2001, there wasn't like a place to go or a thing to, what it was like, oh, there's a medicine out there called ayahuasca, but it wasn't like could do it,
Wow.
and when I did end up going in 2003 down to the Amazon, the way that I was healed was that again, in my fourth ceremony, so I had really made these like leaps and bounds in understanding and recognizing the true potential. And I was just like eating it up. Obviously, I have an affinity for working with ayahuasca.
Mhm.
I turned it into my entire life. But the fourth ceremony, I knew I would be healed. So I had already brought myself to that faith, like 100%, like, I'm going to be healed. I'm going to heal myself tonight. And in the ceremony, my spirit left my body. And at first I turned around and I looked at my stomach like, okay, let me use some x-ray vision. I didn't really know what I was doing,
Oh.
but I couldn't see. And so I was like, okay, what should I do then? And I just came to the idea like, okay, shrink down. And my spirit shrunk down to this little like bite-sized me. And I went in my mouth and down my throat. And then I was in my my stomach.
No.
Yeah, right. And there were these creatures in there. And I was like, I don't think you guys should be here. So I started like removing these little furry creatures that had like spiky teeth, mouths, um and I removed them all. There were like, I don't know, 20 of them or something in there. And then there was just, empty space of my stomach and this dark, murky water in the bottom. And I thought that looks kind of gross, but I drank ayahuasca, I don't know. I don't know. What is it supposed to look like, So I was like, I think I'm done. Came back out, but then I like checked in my body, and I was like, nah, I don't think so. Like I still feel this like wrong, something's still wrong. So I went back in again and I'm like, well, it's got to be in this water. So I didn't look under the surface. So now I'm like, okay, let me go in and check out this, swampy mess down here. And as soon as I got close, I saw two eyes looking back up at me. And it was this squid. And it had its tentacles like wrapped into the exit of my stomach to block it, like to dam it so that it would fill up with this nasty fluid so it could live in my stomach.
Whoa.
And right away, I was like putting these pieces together, like, oh, you fucker, like you can, so like now I'm like, oh, every morning I got to throw this up because you're not like letting it go out because you're damming it, to live in there. So I'm like, I got to get rid of you. So I'm like pulling the suction cups of its tentacles off of the stomach lining and then into my intestines also. And that hurt, like physical pain when I did it, to
Wow.
the point where I was like, maybe I should just leave this thing. And I was like, no, like you'll get over the pain. You'll heal those little suction cup wounds, but you got to get rid of this thing. So I get rid of it. This is all hard to describe. It's like in another dimension, like in a
Yeah.
visionary dream, you could say.
Mm.
And then I knew I was healed. I did like curl up into the fetal position because there was so much pain, but I knew I was healed of the digestive issue that had plagued me for 3 years. Now I was just going to heal up like, these little suction cup wounds. But by the end of the night, I didn't have any pain and I just felt so, relieved isn't even the best, like, I don't know, empowered, right? I was just truly powerful. I had identified my problem and healed it. And then later, months later, I would wind up talking to a parasite specialist and
Mm.
described my experience. And they were like, oh, there's a parasite that looks just like a squid. And
No.
I was
When
like,
you were
oh,
saying that, I was thinking it's a parasite. And I mean, you quite literally took your health into your own hands. You just went in there and scooped it on out. Like that is insane. Oh, I
yeah.
mean,
I mean, I should say this because my story is not the normal story. And I'm not trying to like toot my own horn. I do really feel like everything in my life worked up so that I would be doing this, so that I would start the Ayahuasca Foundation, that I would make it my life,
yeah.
the same way that a professional musician had a experience in their life that obviously isn't normal either, So it's
Mhm.
not like every person, as long as you just go down and do some ayahuasca ceremonies, your spirit will leave your body and you'll fix all your problems. It's possible. It's definitely possible, but it's not really what should be expected.
Mm,
And also, like, even with my description, I was kind of describing the ultimate, right?
yeah.
Like you turn the light on, you see exactly
Mhm.
what it is, you fix it, it's
Mhm.
permanent, and you're done. That is definitely possible, and it happens more often, but still it shouldn't be the expectation. It would be the ultimate goal, it would be the ideal, but usually it's somewhere not 100%, and that's where the integration process like continues to expand on that, where you're like working with it in a
Mm,
sense of like, if you turn the light on in that metaphor, you just see clearly and you never go back, right? But if you aren't fully turning the light on, but you get it brighter, you know, you might now say, okay, I feel much more likely that that animal wasn't an animal. I think it was a toy. But
Mm.
you're not like, I know for sure.
Mm.
You know, I think that's probably more likely.
Yeah.
And so therefore you kind of still need to work on that so that it does replace that truth, as it does replace that reference in
Mm-hmm.
your memories. But some people definitely have it where like it's done, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And but I would say that more likely is that there's a degree of it being done, and that additional work needs to coach that, like to get it closer and closer to that truth. You know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, one of the questions I had actually was like, you know, do you recommend doing it more than once? So for people that come to do, say, for example, one of the 10-day retreats, they, you know, the lights it's on, but as you say, maybe the thing in the corner they still aren't quite sure about. What would your advice be for them? Would it be come back and delve into that further? Or would it be, can you continue some of the work at home, which maybe doesn't include ayahuasca, but it's exploring those memories in more detail?
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, we're focusing kind of on one aspect of our being. There's so many parts to what health is, right? And what
Mm.
it means to be healthy. And I do like have 4 categories of what healthy behavior should be focused on, or maybe what causes unhealthy states of being. and and we try our best to address all of them, or really 3 out of the 4. One of them is injury. So we're not really the place to go. Like if you break a bone or something, probably don't go to an ayahuasca retreat, right? That's one thing that modern medicine, I think, has done a great job with.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those 4, the way I look at it, injury definitely can cause you to not be healthy.
Hmm.
We don't really focus that much on that. But nutrition, or lack of nutrition, can definitely cause you to be unhealthy. And I would say that across the board, especially for now, like where we're at with modern culture,
Mm.
everyone has deficiencies.
Yeah.
Everyone has some level of malnutrition, whether it's a vitamin deficiency or a mineral deficiency, or there's some deficiencies. And unfortunately, like what has been done to our food is definitely the culprit, you know, that contributes so much to that. So we definitely try to give people real food that's nourishing to like bring back better nutrition.
Hmm.
and and part of that is also by doing cleanses that help the absorption of those nutrients. And then the next one would be toxicity as a cause of unhealthiness. Now that's also like incredibly prevalent, more and more prevalent. And to me, that's why we see like rises of illnesses,
Mm.
when in theory we should be seeing everything decrease if we're like improving our medical systems. But we're more and more toxic. And so that's a big part of it. You know,
Mm.
removing toxins is a big part of it. To be honest, like for psoriasis, like to me,
Mm.
removing toxins, that's why you have psoriasis, 2-part, right? Like
Mm.
mostly 2-part. And then the third that I'll get into also, which we've already been talking about, so you can predict it. But nutrition or malnutrition and then toxicity are really important to address. And
Mm.
so we do a lot of cleanses. The ayahuasca ceremonies, of which there are 5, by the way, on a 10-day retreat, also are a version of cleansing for sure. But they're more on the emotional and spiritual elements of cleansing, and mental. Um, Whereas the body, we have cleanses using medicines that are categorized as purgatives, that are specifically designed to clean your digestive system,
Mm.
which no one loves to do because
Yeah.
they like make you throw up or have diarrhea. But they're really important to cleanse the digestive system. We take medicines that cleanse the circulatory system, that cleanse the blood that has those toxins running through them. And we cleanse the central nervous system. Also, like really, really important to have a pure central nervous system, because all of those things can then start to cause all of our current like epidemic of age-related issues like Alzheimer's and dementia and Parkinson's and all those things. To me, that's the case of toxification.
Wow.
And the respiratory system, and we have vapor baths that are like saunas that help us sweat out. So there's a huge detox process in those 10 days, and that's like in conjunction with the work that's being done in those 5 ayahuasca ceremonies, which are every other night during the 10-day retreat.
Wow.
And then that third one, or really the fourth, because I started with injury, is emotional trauma. And the effects of trauma can be really devastating, and they affect the other elements. And that's the part that's like harder to grasp. I mean, we really don't have much of an understanding of the effects of trauma and how trauma works. Unfortunately, there's almost like nothing that is done about it. Not to discredit your therapist, but you know, even the talk therapy just hasn't shown to alleviate trauma very well, and medication doesn't do anything but mask it. But the way that trauma can impact us, you know, one way of saying it would be that you express it in physical illnesses or symptoms. And you know, I guess I could just leave it there, that it gets expressed. I think that more complex is like if you start to hate a part of yourself as a result of the impact of trauma, then your hatred of that part of yourself you'll have a response from the part that you're hating. You know, so if you hate a particular part, you're literally like, I wish you would die cells. And then your cells are like, dude, we're getting the message to like just fuck off. So, you know, let's listen to what the message is. Of course, you don't want to send that message, but because of the trauma, you're trapped in this loop where you're essentially sending and directing your own self towards a lack of health or towards a negative outcome. And so we try to deal with emotional trauma, and that's a lot of what happens in the ayahuasca ceremonies. And then outside of the ceremonies, we do our best to detoxify the body and also to bring back a more nourishing diet. And those 3 components don't have to be done with ayahuasca. I think that ayahuasca is incredibly powerful when it comes to the trauma parts, but outside of that, or anytime like today, you know, we could always engage in a detoxification, or at the very least, we could be more mindful about limiting the toxins, you know, and that, I mean, that should be what our doctors are doing, right? Like if you go if you go in and see your doctor, the very first things they should ask are, what are you eating? You know, and what toxins are entering your system.
Totally.
And, you know, so let's like start there, and let's stop the toxins and improve the nutrition. And you'll make so much progress just by doing that.
100%, rather than the prescription, you know, steroids and God knows what that people are kind of pumping into their body. And then it's just this, you know, repetitive cycle, and then more symptoms show up. And then, I mean, that's why I started this podcast, really, because I was just like so done with like going to the GP and trying to find out answers and having to like self-advocate and being kind of, you know, silenced each time, and knowing fundamentally in my gut that actually that I there were ways of healing myself. And from plant medicine, I actually did heal my psoriasis. It was like within the space of like 4 weeks, and I'd completely healed, and I'd done like a huge gut cleanse before that. And you know, it fluctuates obviously with different stresses that are going on and triggers, then it'll flare up again. So I have to kind of review it, and then look at my diet, look at the toxins, and then, you know, have a chat with my herbalist and see whether we weave in some more plant medicine, depending on the situation. But I mean, that was just like so empowering for me for the first time in my life, to be able to take my own health into my own hands and make that informed decision, which ultimately helped to cure my psoriasis for my wedding day, which was like a huge thing for me in terms of my confidence, in terms of like walking down the aisle, you know, with that, yeah, happiness and contentment. So yeah, so 100%. I think that's so important. I think the work that you're doing is just, honestly, it's like my mind is blown. And
Well,
I
what
mean,
you just described too is kind of almost perfect to what I was pointing out, you know, like, so even without ayahuasca or without that specific treatment for what I'll still refer to as trauma,
mm,
you know, unfortunately, when you have stress, when you have like some negative responses, then there can still be a flare up, right? And so that to me is because, well, you can only go so far, and
yep.
that's where like a treatment like ayahuasca can take it to that last degree, you know, can really
Mm.
like resolve some of that so that you don't have that response that expresses itself in that
Mm,
way.
definitely. Yeah, it feels like the missing link actually for me, especially. So it's definitely gonna be something I look into in more depth. And I wanted to ask, so before we started recording, you were speaking about the new research that you're doing for PTSD and in specifically veterans. So I think this is something that's fascinates me. I mean, there's loads of programs on Netflix on, you know, people like cancer patients who'll be given like a psilocybin, you know, trip, and it helps them to come to terms with dying essentially. And so this used in like a medical format is something that's so fascinating to me, and something that I feel should be available, you know, for everyone in the right situation. So yeah, can you tell us more about the research that you're doing currently, which starts tomorrow, if I'm correct?
Yeah, the pilot study starts tomorrow. In fact, right now, the veterans are like having their preliminary data collected like before the retreat begins, and so they're like working with the Onaya Science Research Team as we
Wow.
speak. Um,
Wow.
so that's a group of 10 veterans, and they were selected because of their already involvement with a group called Heroic Hearts, which is also in the UK
Hmm.
and Canada. And that organization is specifically helping veterans to go to ayahuasca retreats because ayahuasca has been shown so well to alleviate or help with trauma. And so it's this really awesome collaboration. I should and definitely want to mention the Granttown Foundation is funding it. So, an organization in the United States called the Granttown Foundation cared enough to say, can we fund this project? So, they're funding this entire project in collaboration with Heroic Hearts, who already has this network of veterans looking to receive this treatment. Onaya Science, which has already been doing this scientific research and has published the results such that we're able to validate the need for research like this, and then our organization. So it's this really like beautiful coming together. And yeah, that research is incredibly comprehensive. So when I mean data collection, like as gross as it might sound, they are all giving poop samples so that their gut biome can be analyzed before they do the retreat.
Hmm.
And they're giving saliva samples so that their genome can be analyzed before the retreat for potential epigenetic changes. And then they're getting fitted with their EEG helmets, or whatever the right term is for that, so that they can have the brainwave readings to also measure the changes in brainwave function as a result. And then they're also filling out the psychological evaluations. I'm really like um, appreciative that they are so willing to do the research.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're not paying for it,
Mm,
so in that sense, like they're it's a trade-off, like to participate in the study, but to also receive the benefit of
mm,
the retreat itself. But yeah, I mean, it's just like I said, this coming together of all these pieces in a really wonderful way. And I agree with you 100%. I mean, I think that I would love to see a revival of plant medicine and a revival of plant spirit medicine, like an understanding of that use of expanded awareness through particular plant medicines. And psilocybin is definitely one of them. I would say on a global scale, psilocybin should be the like global shamanic medicine, if you want to call it that, but that we don't really have the same depth of understanding of the process of that science of consciousness enhancement that comes from the tradition of its use with psilocybin that we do with ayahuasca. Ayahuasca to me is probably the most intact shamanic tradition in the world. And also like other medicines like ibogaine or iboga rather, and peyote and San Pedro. There are some other plant medicines that do have a tradition, but I don't think that they are as intact as the ayahuasca tradition. So to me, like studying the ayahuasca tradition so that we can integrate the principles of that tradition into our understanding of how other medicines are administered is tremendous value for us. And that's like a big passion for me. I've already like talked about the idea of having chemotherapy ceremonies as a way to introduce and exemplify the impact of elements of the tradition. Whereas if you were to, instead of go to the hospital for a chemotherapy session, which most people hate, and they already have an incredibly negative impression about it, which to me is not conducive to greater benefit. It works against you if you hate the treatment that you want to heal you. It's almost like calling a person you hate when you need some help. You're like probably not going to give you the best quality of help that you want. And so what if you instead like go to this beautiful place in the woods to get your chemotherapy and it's not sterile, it doesn't conjure up all the memories of negative feelings that hospitals tend to do. And that the administration of the chemotherapy is this beautiful performance where you are actually directed towards looking inward. So you're not watching TV while you're on chemo. You're not like distracting yourself intentionally from anything that's happening, but yet at the same time hoping that it will somehow resolve your issues while you do your best to not give any attention to them. And there will be so many of these components, and it's inevitable to me that we could dramatically increase the effectiveness of chemotherapy, which I'm not saying everybody should get chemotherapy, but it's there and it's the go-to. Can we make it better? And I think that it's a great example of how we could integrate a deeper understanding of indigenous or ancestral traditions to improve the effectiveness of our current medical models. And that's what I'm passionate about.
Yeah, I mean, that makes so much sense as well, because I mean, in so many situations on a daily basis now, we're constantly distracting ourselves. If we feel stressed out, if you've just had an argument with somebody, as you say, if somebody's getting chemotherapy in a hospital, you don't want to think about it, even though it's your body is sick effectively, and you've got cancer within the body. And rather than kind of, as you say, going inward, we're detaching from it. So it's just so detached, even our sickness, and just having those negative connotations. So I mean, that sounds incredible. If fingers crossed I never have to do that, but I would 100% sign me up for whatever you do.
Well, I mean, to be totally honest, I'm, a lot of people are like, what are you doing? You want people to get chemotherapy, and honestly, I don't.
That's also another huge discussion.
I do feel that a better approach would be to go deep into detoxification and to go deep into a better nourishment, just like we said, as well as to deal with emotional trauma. Like that to me would be my preference. But trying to like, oh, let's just bring that in, I want to get there, but I also want to be realistic.
Steps.
Right. I want to be realistic.
100%.
But yeah, there was one thing that you said that it was really cool. You were talking about your own healing with psoriasis, and you said, I felt it in my gut. And that little phrase thank God that we still have that phrase, because it really speaks to something that I tie very closely to our ancestry, our ancestral traditions. When we still considered ourselves part of the earth, where we still gave thanks to the elements of nature, like what we recognize now in shamanism, but yet we don't actually hold as a foundational truth in our own realities.
Mm,
And so, unfortunately, we tend to now see ourselves as just like an individual alone on the world, and we're just all like in competition with each other, but at the very least happen to be on the same place at the same time, but without a connection. And I
mm,
think that that itself is a trauma. That is like a cultural trauma that is almost at a species level, because it's so prevalent, that inaccuracy of understanding that wasn't a part of our ancestral tradition. And the gut feeling, why it speaks to me, is because that is the world speaking to you,
mm,
right? And so
mhm,
we're receiving that message through our sensory organs. And yeah, we receive information when we see and stuff, and have the like classic five sensory experiences, but we also have all these other organs that are also sensory organs, but we don't value them. But thankfully, we have gut feeling, right?
mm,
We still have it. It's still there because it's such a reality. And to me, that is proof of the connection, that no, we are part of the earth. I am a part of the region I live in, and I am a part of this entire being that is the earth, that is incredibly wise and incredibly powerful. And because of that connection, right off the bat, we could alleviate the aloneness that is an inaccurate interpretation of our identity, but it
mm,
is a truth that we then build a detrimental belief system on top of. And it's those core truths that I think we need to be able to evaluate, and it's through traditions like ayahuasca that can help us to resolve those or improve those inaccuracies, so that we build our reality on a foundation of truth that serves us. And that truth does not, that we are alone,
mm,
and that we are not supported by the world that we live in. And then you start to then see how you interact with other people, when you
mm,
realize that like you and I are cells in the same body.
mm,
Then of course it will influence my behavior towards you, or
mhm,
influence my behavior towards anyone. And
mhm,
that tree is like a cell in the same body that I am a part of. Therefore my reaction to that tree, the way I treat nature, the way I treat animals, like all of these things starts to change because of
mm,
one core truth that we make more accurate. And that is the truth of our ancestors, of our ancestral traditions, that are some of which are still intact, like the Amazonian traditions of ayahuasca.
wow. Yeah, I mean, I could listen to you all day. So I wanted to finish up today. For anyone listening who is interested in ayahuasca, but they don't know where to start online, where do they go? Where's the best place for them to have a look? Do you have any websites, any books that we can read? Yeah, that would be amazing.
Well, I'm writing a book. So
Hey,
hopefully this year, a book will come out by me. But yeah, you can
amazing.
visit our website, which is ayahuascafoundation.org, or just search for Ayahuasca Foundation. I'm Carlos Tanner. You can also search for me. I have the Ayahuasca Foundation has a YouTube channel, and on that channel is a series of 10 episodes called Lessons from Ayahuasca. So that might be a good place to start if you do think that ayahuasca might be a good path to take. I do try to go through like all the different elements, some of which we talked about today. But of course, our website does have a lot of information. Other books that I might recommend, there is an author named Joe Tafur who wrote a book called Fellowship of the River. He's a friend of mine. He's a medical doctor in the US, but he did a 5-year apprenticeship in the Shipibo tradition, which is really unique. I would also recommend the author Leonard Laskow. who wrote Healing with Love and Forgiving Love. He's a big influence, even though I don't think he's ever drank ayahuasca, but his understanding of how consciousness and its combination with love and the highest frequency of emotions are the most powerful thing that we can have. And that's what I brought up at the very beginning about healing as an art form. And so if I had one thing to say, I would like suggest the consideration of healing as an art form, and such that when you go to your doctor, the way you feel about your doctor is incredibly important, and you want to have a feeling of the highest frequency possible, right? You want to love your doctor, and you want to love the medicine and the treatment. That is, if as close as you can get, will directly correlate to the amount of benefit you receive from your doctor, from the treatment, and from the medicine.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for your time today. I feel like, honestly, there's so many more questions that I've got, but it's been eye-opening for me, and something I'm going to look into in more depth now. And who knows, maybe I'll make it to the Amazon to join you one day.
All right, cool.
Thank you so much, and thank you for listening to the Moody Girl audience. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.